Before there was a Walmart on every corner, before self-checkout lanes and loyalty cards and 16 varieties of hummus, there was a place at the end of your street where everybody knew your name, your mother's name, and exactly how much you still owed on last month's tab. Cast your mind back to a time when a small-town grocery store was the beating heart of an entire community, when the man behind the counter had watched you grow up, had carried your grandmother's bags to her car without being asked, and had quietly extended credit to your family during a hard winter without making you feel small. When the shelves weren't endless. When the choices were few. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. This is the story of how small-town America fed itself, clothed itself, and held itself together long before the supermarket ever arrived. Hello and welcome back to American Retold, the channel where we dust off the forgotten corners of American history and hold them up to the light. I'm so glad you're here today, because this one is something truly special. We're going back to a time largely before 1960, and in many rural pockets of this country, well into the 1970s when the big box supermarket simply did not exist in small-town America. And yet people ate. They fed their families, preserved their harvests, bartered with their neighbors, and relied on a remarkable network of local stores, traveling merchants, and community wisdom that modern America has all but forgotten. Today, we're going to walk through exactly how they did it. We'll explore the general stores, the traveling peddlers, the root sellers, the community gardens, the ice wagons, the mail-order catalogs, and the extraordinary web of trust that held rural communities together. If you're new here and you love stories like this about the real, lived experience of everyday Americans, please do hit that subscribe button. We add new videos every week, and trust me, you do not want to miss what's coming. Now then, let's step back in time. To understand how small-town America fed itself, you first have to understand the America it was living in. In the years between the two world wars, roughly 1920 through 1945, the majority of Americans still lived in rural communities or small towns with fewer than 2,500 residents. These were farming towns, mining towns, mill towns. Towns named things like Mill Haven, Dry Creek, and Calhoun Corners. Towns where the main street was 3 blocks long and everyone on those blocks had known each other since birth. The Great Depression had hit these communities like a freight train. By 1932, unemployment had reached 25% nationally. In rural areas, families who had already been living close to the bone were now teetering on the edge. A dozen eggs cost around 18 cents. A pound of coffee was about 35 cents. And an average factory worker, if he still had a job, was pulling in maybe $17 a week. Under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the New Deal programs brought some relief. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work. Rural electrification slowly brought power to farms that had never seen an electric light. But in between those years of struggle and the post-war boom that followed, small-town America had to survive on its own terms. And survive it did. The first self-service supermarket, King Cullen, opened in Jamaica, Queens in 1930, was a revelation in its time. But it took decades for that model to reach the rural heartland. In the meantime, small towns had their own systems, their own rhythms, their own beautiful and remarkably effective ways of making sure nobody went hungry. And those systems tell us more about the American spirit than any history textbook ever could. If the small town had a soul, it lived inside the general store. Walk through that front door and you knew it by the bell that jangled overhead, and you were hit immediately by a smell that you will never ever forget. Coffee beans and leather harnesses. Pickle brine and fresh-cut tobacco. Sawdust on the floorboards and something baking somewhere in the back. The general store was precisely what its name promised: general. You could buy a pound of flour, a coil of rope, a pair of work boots, a bottle of cod liver oil, and a sheet of stamps, all in the same transaction. Behind the counter, the proprietor, usually a man who had inherited the store from his father, knew every family in the county by name. He knew who was going through a hard patch. He knew who had a new baby coming. He knew who could be trusted to pay on account, and who might need a quiet word. The credit system at a general store was nothing like a modern credit card. It was personal. Handwritten in a ledger that the storekeeper kept behind the counter like a confidential diary of the whole town's financial life. Families would run a tab through the winter and settle up come harvest time, or when the husband got paid from the mill. No interest. No late fees, just trust. The general store was also the post office, the bank, the rumor mill, the community notice board, and on a slow Tuesday afternoon the unofficial town council. Old men sat around the wood stove and solved every problem in the world except the ones that actually needed solving. It wasn't just a shop. It was the place where the town talked to itself. Not every family could get into town, and the town knew it. For the farms and homesteads that sat miles from the nearest main street, salvation arrived on 4 wheels or 4 hooves, depending on the decade. The traveling merchant was one of the great unsung heroes of rural American life. He came by wagon in the early decades of the 20th century and by truck after the roads improved in the 1930s and 40s. He carried everything the general store carried, except he brought it to you. Spices, salt, bolts of fabric, needles and thread, patent medicines, seasonal tools. If you were there, you will never forget it, the sight of that wagon cresting the hill, and your mother dropping whatever she was doing to grab her apron pocket and count what she had. The most famous traveling merchants of all were the Raleigh men, salesmen working for the W.T. Raleigh Company out of Freeport, Illinois, founded in 1889. The Raleigh Company sent independent salesmen across rural America carrying cases of household products, liniments, spices, flavoring extracts, and medicines. The Raleigh man was as reliable a seasonal visitor as the first frost. Families planned around his arrival. Children looked forward to him the way they looked forward to Christmas. He always had something new in his case. He always had time for a cup of coffee and the news from the last farm down the road. The Jewel Tea Company ran a similar operation, delivering coffee, tea, and kitchen staples directly to rural housewives on a regular route. Their signature autumn leaf pattern on the dishware became one of the most collected designs in American history, a small luxury delivered to women who worked extraordinarily hard and were given very little. When that wagon came over the hill, it wasn't just commerce arriving. It was the world, knocking on your door. If the general store was the town's larder, the kitchen garden was every family's lifeline. In small town and rural America, before the age of the supermarket, you did not simply buy food. You grew it, preserved it, stored it, traded it, and if the year was good you ate well from it clear through until the following spring. The kitchen garden sat behind almost every home in America. Tomatoes, beans, sweet corn, potatoes, squash, cucumbers, okra in the south, rutabaga in the north. Nothing was wasted. What you couldn't eat fresh, you canned. Every August and September, the kitchen became a hot, steaming, exhausting factory. Ball mason jars lined up like soldiers on the counter. Pressure canners hissing on the stove. Mothers and grandmothers working side by side from before sunrise until after dark. Those jars went down into the root cellar, a cool, dark, earthen room beneath the house that served as the family's refrigerator, freezer, and pantry all in one. Potatoes and onions in bins on the floor. Smoked hams and slabs of bacon hanging from the rafters. Jars of green beans, peach preserves, apple butter, pickled beets stacked to the ceiling. A family with a good root cellar was a family that would make it through the winter. A family without one lay awake at night and prayed for an early spring. The knowledge that went into those root cellars, what to store where, how long things kept, how to tell when something had turned, was passed from mother to daughter across generations, as precious as any inheritance. It wasn't survival. It was an art form. Long before Jeff Bezos was a glimmer in anyone's eye, a thick, gloriously heavy catalog arrived in mailboxes across rural America and changed everything. The Sears, Roebuck and Company catalog, known simply as the Wishbook, was first mailed to American consumers in 1888. By 1897, it ran to 507 pages. By the 1920s and 30s, it was the size of a small encyclopedia. You could order anything. Clothing, furniture, farm equipment, musical instruments, bicycles, and beginning in 1908, entire pre-cut houses, delivered by rail and assembled on your property. More than 70,000 Sears kit homes were sold between 1908 and 1940. Some of them are still standing today. For families who could not reach the nearest town, the Sears catalog was a lifeline. Children pored over it at Christmas time the way children today scroll through Amazon wish lists. A girl in Kansas could order a dress from a catalog and feel, briefly, connected to the wider world. A farmer in Alabama could price out a new plow without ever leaving his land. Montgomery Ward ran an equally beloved competing catalog, and the rivalry between the two was the kind of thing families had genuine opinions about. You were a Sears family or a Ward family, and that was a part of your identity. You know exactly what I mean. When the wishbook arrived, for one wonderful evening, no matter where you lived or how little you had, you could dream. Money was scarce, but ingenuity was not. In small-town America before and during the Depression, an informal barter economy operated alongside and sometimes instead of the cash economy. And it was remarkable in its reach and its generosity. A woman who kept chickens might trade eggs for the use of a neighbor's draft horse at plowing time. A farmer with a surplus of corn might trade bushels for the blacksmith's labor. A family whose cow had freshened might share the extra milk with the widow 3 farms over in exchange for mending or childcare. None of this was written down. None of it was formal. It operated entirely on the currency of reputation and trust. Barn raisings were the most dramatic expression of this spirit. They were the infrastructure of daily life. The Wholesome Bread Company and Wonder Bread had delivery routes through small towns by the 1930s, and the arrival of that white waxed paper loaf was a small but genuine weekly pleasure. When the first electric refrigerators began to appear in homes, the GE Monitor Top, released in 1927, sold for around $300, which was roughly 6 months' wages. For many families, the Iceman's days were numbered. But for a generation of Americans, those deliveries were the rhythm of domestic life. The sound of the milk bottles on the stoop in the dark. The horse's hooves on the morning street. The cold, clean smell of a fresh block of ice. If you were there, you will never forget it. When everything else failed, there was the church hall and the neighbor's porch. In small-town America before the age of the welfare state, the social safety net was made not of federal programs but of community bonds. It was stitched together at church suppers, at Grange meetings, at quilting circles, at the Ladies' Aid Society bake sales that kept half the congregation afloat through hard winters. The Grange, formerly the National Grange of the Order of Patrons of Husbandry, founded in 1867, was one of the most powerful community institutions in rural America. At its peak in the 1870s, it had more than 850,000 members. And it served not just as a political lobbying organization for farmers, but as a social network, a cooperative buying club, and an insurance system, all wrapped in one. Through the Grange, small farmers could buy seed and equipment in bulk at lower prices. They could access crop insurance. They could sit in a warm hall on a January evening and feel like they belonged to something larger than themselves. The church operated similarly. When a family lost a crop to drought or a mother to illness, the congregation moved. Casseroles appeared on doorsteps. Work parties assembled in fields. Children were quietly folded into neighboring households for meals and after-school care. There was no application form. There was no eligibility assessment. There was just a knock on the door and a casserole dish on the threshold. Those were the days. And if we are being honest with ourselves, we have never quite replaced what was lost when those communities began to dissolve. Did you know that the first self-service grocery store in America, the Piggly Wiggly, opened by Clarence Saunders in Memphis, Tennessee in 1916, was considered so revolutionary that Saunders patented the entire concept of self-service retail? Before Piggly Wiggly, you handed a list to a clerk and he fetched everything for you. The idea of walking the aisles and choosing your own items was genuinely considered dangerous and confusing to shoppers who had never done it. Did you know that the Sears catalog once sold a complete do-it-yourself house kit, including pre-cut lumber, nails, doors, windows, and detailed instructions for as little as $650 in 1908? In today's money, that's roughly $22,000 for an entire house. Some of those homes still stand in small towns across America, perfectly respectable a century later, built by families with nothing but time and determination. In 1950, the average American family spent about 30% of their household income on food. Today, that number is closer to 10%. In one sense, that is a triumph of modern efficiency. In another, it tells you something about how radically the nature of food and the relationship between communities and their food has changed. In the 1930s and 40s, the average small-town American could name the farm where their milk came from. They could tell you what field their potatoes had been grown in and who had planted them. Today, the average American has no idea and no particular way of finding out. The supermarket arrived in rural America in earnest in the 1950s and 60s, as the interstate highway system opened up distribution networks that had been impossible before. The general stores began to close, one by one, through the 1960s and 70s. The traveling merchants vanished. The home delivery routes dried up. And the communities that had organized themselves around those rhythms and relationships had to reorganize around something new, something more efficient, more anonymous, and in some ways less alive. This is not nostalgia for poverty or hardship. Nobody is suggesting that credit ledgers and root cellars were better than a well-stocked refrigerator. But there is something worth pausing over in the question of what was gained, and what was quietly, irreversibly lost. Because the Iceman didn't just bring ice. He brought news, and connection, and the sense that somebody would notice if you hadn't been out on your porch for a few days. Now, this is the part I love most. Because this channel is not just about the history I can tell you, it's about the history you carry. So many of you watching this right now grew up in these communities, or your parents or grandparents did. You remember the general store. You remember the milk bottles on the stoop. You remember helping your grandmother put up jars in the kitchen on a hot August afternoon. The steam rising from the canner and the smell of something sweet and sharp in the air. I want to hear from you. Down in the comments, tell me, what is the one shop, delivery route, or community tradition from your own family's past that you wish still existed today? I read every single comment. And the best ones might just end up in a future episode. And so there you have it. The full, remarkable, deeply human story of how small-town America fed itself, clothed itself, and held itself together before the age of the supermarket. It did it through general stores that ran on trust. Through traveling merchants who brought the world to your door. Through kitchen gardens and root cellars and the knowledge passed between generations of women who were never once called experts and never needed to be. Through the wishbook and the grange and the barn raisings and the casseroles on doorsteps. Through every neighbor who extended a hand. Every shopkeeper who opened a ledger. Every iceman who left a little extra for the kids. This was not a perfect America. It was hard, and it was unequal, and it was full of struggle. But inside that struggle was something that deserves to be remembered with full and genuine respect. The refusal to give up. The insistence on community. The extraordinary, stubborn, beautiful belief that you look after your own. Those were the days. And we are richer for knowing they happened. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. It genuinely helps more people find this channel and keeps these stories alive. Leave a comment, share it with someone who loves American history, and if you haven't already, please subscribe. We are building something here, a community of people who believe these stories matter. Next week on American Retold, we are going somewhere equally fascinating. We are going to look at the American Drive and how a parking lot became a cultural institution, a teenager's first taste of freedom, and the beating heart of a decade. You are not going to want to miss it. Until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and we will see you on the next one.